Once upon a time in the year 1851, deep in the quiet hills of Virginia, two brothers were born. Identical twins, same face, same eyes, same blood. But from the moment they came into this world, something was different. One of them was loving, kind, and full of life. The other was silent, cold, watching things no one else could see. Over time, one boy disappeared. The other? His story became so strange, so dark, that science itself refused to study it. No books. No records. No answers. Just a case buried in whispers and fear. Welcome to Behind the Genius, the channel where we explore the minds and mysteries the world chose to forget. Strange inventions, lost experiments, forgotten people, and the terrifying truths science left behind. If stories like this make you curious, if you're drawn to the hidden side of history, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell. There's always more to uncover. Because sometimes, genius isn't just rare. It's dangerous. The early morning of March 14, 1851, brought a thick fog that rolled down from the Blue Ridge Mountains, covering the farms and roads like a blanket. It was unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed unsure whether to sing. In a small wooden farmhouse just outside the quiet town of Elk Ridge, Eleanor Henderson was in labor. Her husband, Tobias, paced outside the bedroom, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Inside, the midwife, a woman named Martha Cleary, leaned over Eleanor, whose face was pale with pain. After hours of pushing, the first baby arrived. A healthy boy. Strong heartbeat. Pink skin. A loud, beautiful cry filled the room. His name would be Edgar. Then came silence. Nearly 10 minutes passed before the second child was born. He looked just like Edgar. Same curly dark hair, same gray eyes, but something was different. The baby didn't cry. He didn't move. For a moment, Martha thought he was stillborn. But then, his eyes opened. Slowly. Calmly. Too calmly. He stared at her like an adult would, eyes too focused for a newborn. This one they named Elijah. Martha never returned to the Henderson house again. Years later, when asked why, she simply said, "I delivered many children in my time. Only once did one look back at me like he already knew me." As the days passed, the twins grew. To the outside world, they looked the same, two beautiful, healthy boys. But Eleanor, a sharp and thoughtful woman, noticed things. Edgar laughed. Elijah watched. Edgar would reach for her finger, cling to her dress, smile when rocked. Elijah would lie still for hours, eyes wide open, staring at shadows on the ceiling. When Edgar cried, Elijah stayed quiet. Always quiet. At night, Edgar slept peacefully. Elijah didn't sleep at all. Eleanor sometimes found him awake in the crib, eyes unblinking, not crying, not fussing, just watching. At first, Tobias thought Eleanor was imagining things. "They're babies," he'd say. "Let them be." But one evening he walked in and found Elijah standing in his crib. Not pulling himself up like most toddlers do, standing upright, both feet flat, without wobbling. Staring at him. He didn't fall. He didn't smile. He just stood there. Tobias didn't sleep that night. As they grew older, the differences became more obvious. At age 2, Edgar was learning to speak in full sentences. He loved to draw birds and flowers, and he followed his mother around, always asking questions. Elijah didn't speak at all. He made no sounds except for an occasional hum, a deep, slow sound that vibrated in his throat like a chant. Eleanor began keeping a journal. She wrote everything down, every odd behavior, every strange sound Elijah made, every difference between the boys. Here's one of her early entries. April 2, 1853, Edgar brought me flowers again today. He's full of joy. Elijah sat in the orchard, carving into the dirt. Not shapes. Not letters. Just lines. But when I looked closer, it looked like a symbol I once saw in the church book. An old one from the Old Testament pages that were written in Hebrew. By the time they turned 4, Edgar had made friends in town. He was sweet and helpful. But Elijah frightened other children. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He had no interest in toys. One child claimed Elijah knew what he was thinking and burst into tears. Even animals reacted strangely. Birds flew away when Elijah came near. The Hendersons' cat hissed and refused to enter the same room. One day the cat vanished. Edgar said he saw Elijah following it into the orchard. Eleanor didn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. But Tobias had started to change too. He was once a calm man, a former schoolteacher, patient and logical. Now he barely spoke. He stopped going into Elijah's room. One night he whispered to Eleanor, "He listens at the walls. At night. I can hear him talking. But not to himself. To something else." By age 5, Edgar was drawing colorful houses and horses. Elijah was still carving symbols, now into the wooden floor beneath his bed. Tobias tried to paint over them. The next morning they were carved deeper. Eleanor took one of the symbols to Father Whitmore, the town's priest. He turned pale when he saw it and said, "This is old. Very old. I've seen something like this only once, in an ancient book locked in our archives. But no child should know it." The family began to isolate themselves. No more guests. No church. No school. Edgar would ask why he couldn't play with the others. He missed people. But Elijah didn't care. He just sat at the window, eyes on the forest, whispering sounds that didn't match any language his parents knew. One cold morning, Eleanor found both boys sitting outside by the orchard. Edgar looked tired, pale. Elijah was humming again. When asked what they were doing, Edgar said, "Elijah showed me the hole." "What hole?" Eleanor asked. Elijah looked up and said, for the first time in weeks, "The one under us." Eleanor searched the yard and found nothing. But that night she began hearing a faint humming sound beneath the floorboards, just like the one Elijah made. When Tobias pulled up a section of the wooden floor in Elijah's room, he found nothing underneath. But the wood was warm, as if something below had been heating it. After that, Tobias locked Elijah's room at night. He said it was for everyone's safety. But it didn't help. The next night, Edgar woke up screaming. He said Elijah had been standing above him, not beside the bed, above it, floating just inches from the ceiling, whispering words that made his ears ring. Eleanor checked Elijah's room. The door was locked from the outside. When she opened it, he was inside, sitting calmly in the corner, eyes closed, humming. She never told Tobias. But the next day she wrote this in her journal. June 11, 1856. "I love my boys. I love them both. But I know, one of them did not come from us. One of them is borrowing a shape. I don't know from where. But he is learning, watching, practicing." She began hiding her journal in a chest beneath the floor. The town had begun to talk. "Something's wrong with the Henderson twins," they whispered. "They were born the same, but one of them isn't right." By the end of that summer, Edgar stopped drawing. He grew quiet. "Set." Eleanor asked why. He replied, "He's dreaming in my head. And I can feel the dreams." That night, Eleanor heard both boys whispering in the dark. But when she opened the door, only Elijah was awake. And he wasn't whispering. He was listening. By the time the Henderson twins turned 6, it was clear to their parents that something deeply unusual was happening inside their home. The boys still looked the same on the outside, same height, same eyes, same curls, but everything else about them had grown apart like two separate worlds. Edgar was soft-spoken, polite, and often tired. He spent more time drawing alone in the barn or sleeping on the porch with their dog. But he was growing distant. His mother noticed he rarely laughed anymore. He often had dark circles under his eyes and said he felt full of someone else's thoughts. Elijah, on the other hand, seemed more alert than ever. He still didn't play, didn't cry, and rarely blinked. But one morning something happened that no one could explain. It was quiet in the house. Eleanor was sewing in the kitchen when she heard a voice, not Edgar's, not Tobias's, but deep and smooth, reciting a strange sentence. She tiptoed to the hallway and peeked around the corner. Elijah was sitting alone on the floor. He was speaking in Latin. Clear, proper Latin. Word after word, steady and perfect. She froze. The only person in the house who knew Latin was Tobias, and he hadn't spoken it since his teaching days. Elijah had never been taught even the alphabet. Later that day she asked him where he had heard those words. He stared at her and replied, "They were in my dream." But they weren't dreams. They were blue. When Tobias came home and she told him, he didn't believe it. "Maybe he heard me reading years ago," he said, waving it off. That evening, Tobias sat Elijah down and read a few sentences from an old Greek textbook. Not Latin, but classical Greek. Elijah interrupted him twice to correct his pronunciation. Tobias turned white. He closed the book and said nothing. That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "He shouldn't know these words. He shouldn't even know letters. I feel like there is someone else inside him. Someone ancient, someone watching us from behind his eyes." Over the next few weeks, Elijah began speaking more, but never to people. He would stand in corners, whispering to cracks in the walls, or crouch by the fireplace, talking softly to the ashes. Sometimes he used English, sometimes strange sounds, sometimes full sentences in languages no one in the family had ever heard. At the same time, Edgar's health started to fade. He began waking up at night, sweating and shaking. He had terrible dreams. Dreams he couldn't explain. "It's like he's trying to pull me into something," he told Eleanor. Like he's showing me, inside. Eleanor and Tobias tried to separate the boys at night. Edgar would sleep in their room while Elijah stayed in his. But somehow, Elijah always knew what Edgar had dreamed. One morning Edgar said, "He saw my dream. And he changed it." Tobias became angry. "That's enough," he said. "No more of this. They need normal life." But there was no normal anymore. One day the town doctor, Dr. Abel Grant, visited the house. Tobias had asked him to check on Edgar, hoping he could explain the sleepwalking, the weakness, and the nosebleeds that had started appearing every few days. Dr. Grant examined Edgar and said it might be stress. "The boy's sensitive," he said. "Some twins feel the emotions of their siblings. He might just be reacting to Elijah." Then he looked at Elijah. The moment their eyes met, Dr. Grant paused. "Elijah," he said carefully, "can you tell me your name?" Elijah didn't move. Then he said, "You have a crack in your tooth. You sleep with your window open. And you write letters to a woman who is not your wife." The room fell silent. Dr. Grant left without saying another word. He never came back. That night, Edgar had a seizure. Tobias tried to carry him to the town hospital, but the horses refused to move. They kicked and fought until they were released. In the end, Eleanor stayed up all night holding Edgar, praying over him. Elijah sat in the corner of the room watching. Just watching. By the next week, Eleanor stopped writing in her journal. She burned the last 3 pages, afraid of what she had written. Tobias, who had once taught philosophy and logic at a school in Richmond, now refused to speak Elijah's name at all. Instead, he referred to him as the other one. Still, something even stranger was happening. Elijah had stopped aging. At least it looked that way. Edgar was growing taller, his face becoming thinner. But Elijah's body stayed the same, small, quiet, pale. Eleanor noticed it first when dressing them for church one day. Edgar's sleeves were too short. Elijah's clothes still fit perfectly. When she measured them, Edgar had grown 1.5 inches in 6 months. Elijah hadn't grown at all. But his mind? It was racing ahead. He could now draw perfect circles by hand. He wrote symbols that looked like ancient carvings from distant parts of the world. One symbol appeared again and again, a spiral inside a square with lines stretching out like legs. Eleanor found it carved into furniture, into the barn walls, into the backs of books. One night, Tobias found the symbol burned into the palm of Edgar's hand. No one knew how it got there. Eleanor begged Tobias to send for help. Tobias refused. "No doctor will believe us," he said. "And if they do, they'll take them away." But help was already coming, not from doctors but from strangers. It began with a letter sent by someone calling themselves Mr. R. No return address. No name. Just a note written in black ink on old paper. "We've heard about the boy who sees in sleep. We're coming to study him. Do not resist. You won't see us arrive, but we'll know when the door is unlocked." 3 days later, Eleanor found a small coin on the porch, but it wasn't from any known country. And one morning she woke up to find 3 tall men standing in the parlor, speaking softly to Tobias. They wore long coats and round black hats. Their eyes were dark. Their hands gloved. One of them had a small machine, a metal box that clicked softly even though it had no wires. They asked only one question. "Has he drawn the gate yet?" When Tobias said yes, they smiled. They said they would return in 1 week. No more. No less. That night, Elijah spoke again. He stood beside Eleanor's bed and whispered, "They're not from here either. But they want what I know. They think I don't remember. But I do." When she asked what he remembered, Elijah smiled gently and said, "Before this, I was part of the dark between the stars." Then he walked back to his room and shut the door. And in the silence that followed, Eleanor realized something. Elijah was no longer learning. He was remembering. The orchard behind the Henderson farmhouse had always been a peaceful place. Rows of apple trees stretched across the back field, their branches bending gently with the wind. It was a quiet spot, perfect for thinking, or forgetting. But that peace began to break in the summer of 1858, when Eleanor noticed something strange. Every morning Elijah would disappear. Sometimes before breakfast. Sometimes before the sun was even up. At first she thought he was just wandering around the property. But one morning she followed him, staying far behind so he wouldn't see her. She watched from behind the barn as Elijah walked silently into the orchard, barefoot and calm. He moved through the trees like he knew exactly where he was going. Then, without hesitation, he stopped and stared at the ground. At first, Eleanor saw nothing unusual. Just grass and dirt beneath the trees. But then she looked closer. There was a hole. perfectly round. Maybe 4 feet across, maybe deeper than it looked. Around the edge, someone had placed smooth stones in a careful circle. The soil inside the hole wasn't fresh, it looked like it had been opened and closed many times. Elijah didn't speak. He just stood there staring down. Then, as if hearing something, he sat cross-legged beside it, placed both palms on the ground and began humming. It was that same sound, low, steady, deep enough to vibrate in your chest. Eleanor's hands began to shake. She backed away before he could see her. Later that night, she told Tobias what she saw. He didn't say a word. He simply walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the floor for a long time. The next morning, Edgar didn't wake up. He was breathing but he wouldn't open his eyes. His skin was cold. Eleanor tried everything, warm blankets, wet cloths, even herbs from town. Nothing worked. Hours passed. Then just before sunset, Edgar gasped and sat up. His eyes were wild. His skin was covered in sweat. When Eleanor asked what had happened, he whispered. He was talking to the pit. And it talked back. From that day on, Edgar changed. He barely spoke. His drawings turned dark, twisted trees, black skies, spiral symbols that looped into themselves. One picture showed Elijah standing in the orchard, arms stretched out, with something rising from the pit behind him. Something big, something not fully drawn. Almost like Edgar was afraid to finish it. Tobias took a shovel and tried to fill in the hole. He didn't get far. When he reached the pit, he said the ground was too hard, like stone beneath soft earth. The shovel snapped at the handle. He went to town to borrow a pickaxe. That night, the humming started again, louder than ever. The floorboards vibrated. The clock stopped ticking. Glasses shattered in the cupboard. Eleanor found Elijah sitting by the front window, whispering. You shouldn't have closed it. It was listening. By morning, the pit had reopened itself. And Edgar was sick again. The family dog, their last pet, vanished from the yard. Its tracks ended at the orchard. Eleanor wrote once more in her journal. July 2, 1858. Something is below us. Not a thing of this earth. I can feel it when Elijah hums. I feel it in my chest like it wants to come through. And now Edgar is weaker. I don't know if the pit is pulling him, or if Elijah is pushing him. Soon after, Edgar began sleepwalking. He would rise in the night, eyes still closed, and walk in a straight line, always toward the orchard. Eleanor and Tobias had to lock the doors and even place a chair in front of them. One night, Edgar was found outside, barefoot and bleeding from his feet, standing at the edge of the pit. He didn't know how he had gotten there. He had no memory of leaving his bed. That same night, Tobias stood by the window with his shotgun and said, We're leaving. We're taking Edgar and going north. I don't care where. He needs help. Real help. But they never left. Because the 3 men in black coats returned. They arrived unannounced just after sunset, standing at the front porch like they had never left. No wagon, no horses. Just standing there. Eleanor opened the door. One of them stepped inside without asking. He removed his hat, revealing a perfectly bald head and eyes that didn't blink. He looked at Elijah, who stood calmly at the far end of the hall. Then he turned to Tobias and said, Has he drawn the opening? Tobias nodded. They stayed for 2 hours. They didn't eat. They didn't drink. They sat with Elijah in his room and asked him questions no one else understood. One man scribbled notes in a notebook filled with symbols instead of words. Another held the metal box again, the one that clicked softly without any visible parts. When they left, one of them whispered something to Eleanor that made her blood run cold. He is not the first. But he is the furthest along. After they left, Elijah became completely silent for 3 days. On the 4th day, Edgar collapsed while drawing. The paper showed the orchard, only now the trees were bent backward, almost as if pulled toward the pit. In the center of the drawing, the pit was no longer empty. It was glowing with long fingers reaching upward. Edgar was taken to the doctor again. This time, Dr. Grant refused to speak at all when they brought up Elijah. He simply said, Your son is dying from something I've never seen. That evening, Eleanor found new carvings beneath Elijah's bed, not symbols this time but words. Words written in backward Latin. She copied them carefully and took them to Father Whitmore. He read the first sentence aloud, then gasped and dropped the paper. His voice shook as he said, That's not a prayer. That's a calling. A summoning. He told her to burn it. She did. But the next morning, the words were scratched into the walls of the kitchen. Elijah sat at the table, staring at them as if waiting for someone to answer. That was when Eleanor realized. The pit wasn't just a hole in the earth. It was a door. and Elijah wasn't trying to open it. He was asking permission. The leaves had just started to turn red when a letter arrived without a stamp. It was placed on the Hendersons' front porch, though no one had seen who left it. The paper was yellowed. The ink unusually dark. The handwriting was clean and perfect, almost as if done by a machine. Read. Your son has progressed beyond projection. We are coming. No interference. No signature. No return address. Tobias, already on edge from months of strange events, wanted to burn it. Eleanor, trembling, hid it in her sewing box. She didn't know why, only that part of her believed they were being watched. The very next evening, just before the sun dipped below the trees, a black carriage appeared at the edge of the orchard. The wheels made no sound. No horse pulled it. It simply sat there, still and waiting. From it stepped 3 men, dressed in black overcoats and rounded hats. They looked just like the visitors from before, but older, or maybe not. Their faces were strange, too smooth, too still, like masks that had never aged. One held a long black case. Another carried a small, square box made of brass, covered in strange dents and glowing lines. None of them introduced themselves. They simply walked toward the house. Tobias stepped out with his rifle. One of the men raised his hand, not threateningly, just a calm signal. We're not here to harm your family, he said. But you must let us see the boy. It's important. For everyone. Tobias didn't move. You never gave your names. The man smiled faintly. Because you couldn't say them. Elijah stood behind the door, already waiting. He stepped outside before anyone called him. Walked straight past his mother, past his father, and stood directly in front of the 3 men. They didn't speak to him like a child. They nodded. He nodded back. Then they entered the house. For the next 3 days the men stayed in the guest room. They did not sleep. They did not eat. They barely blinked. But they spent hours alone with Elijah, asking him questions, showing him symbols, playing recordings on the strange brass device, sounds that made Eleanor dizzy just hearing through the walls. Once Tobias peeked inside. He saw Elijah sitting calmly at a table, drawing spirals that rotated in on themselves. The men were speaking to him in clicks and tones, like a language made of pure sound. That night, Eleanor found Edgar curled up on the porch, trembling. He was clutching one of his old drawings. It showed their house split down the middle with a second version of Elijah standing in the basement, darker, taller, with no face. When she asked what it meant, Edgar whispered, "They think he's learning from them. But they don't know, he already learned from something else." The next day something terrifying happened. Eleanor woke up to find Elijah standing in the middle of the living room. He wasn't blinking. His lips were moving but no sound came out. She leaned in. His mouth was repeating a name, over and over, but it wasn't a human name. It was just a string of sounds that made her ears hurt. Her nose began to bleed. She staggered back. The brass device on the table clicked loudly and shut off by itself. One of the men rushed in. "We must stop," he said. "He's crossing the threshold too quickly." That evening, Eleanor finally demanded answers. She cornered one of the men while the others were preparing a new set of tools. "What do you want from him?" she asked. "He's a child. He's our son." The man looked at her with something like pity. "He may look like your son. But he's only wearing that shape. The signal inside him isn't human. It doesn't belong to any one place. It's old, older than speech, older than memory." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. Then he added, "This isn't possession. It's return." Later that night, Tobias tried to lock the men out of Elijah's room. But when he turned the key, the door melted in his hand, the wood turning soft like wax, the metal dripping onto the floor. Eleanor screamed. From inside the room came a hum so loud the glass in the windows shattered. When they burst in, Elijah was standing in the middle of the floor, arms raised. The brass device was floating midair, spinning. Then it dropped. Elijah collapsed. The lights went out. The men left the next morning. They said only one thing. "He has gone further than any before him. You won't understand what he's becoming. But you must not stop it. If you try, it will happen faster." They left behind the brass device. It never turned on again. Eleanor begged Tobias to send Elijah away. "We'll take him to the church. We'll find help." But Tobias had broken down. He stopped speaking. He sat in the cellar, night after night, muttering numbers to himself, scratching the same spiral Elijah always drew onto the walls. Edgar, now weak and pale, stopped drawing altogether. He began to forget things, the name of their dog, the name of his schoolteacher, even the name of his mother. One day he asked, "Am I Elijah?" Eleanor cried for the first time in years. On the last day of October, a cold wind came early. Leaves blew in through the broken window. Eleanor found Elijah in the orchard again, sitting by the pit. Only now, the pit wasn't empty. A soft blue light was rising from it. She watched him place his hand over the glow, eyes closed, humming. She turned away. When she returned just moments later, he was gone. She ran to the house in panic, but found him already inside, dry, calm, sitting by the fire. He looked up and said, "It let me see." "What did you see?" she whispered. "Not what's down there." He smiled. "What's underneath that?" That night, Eleanor sealed her journal shut. She wrapped it in cloth and nailed it into the wall. She would never write again. Because something had changed in Elijah. He was no longer listening. Now he was responding. Snow came early to Shenandoah County that year. It blanketed the valley in white, turning the trees brittle and the ground hard as iron. But inside the Henderson farmhouse the cold was worse. It wasn't just winter air anymore, it was something deeper. Something unnatural. Something that settled into the walls. Eleanor noticed it first when she touched the baby grand piano in the parlor. Its keys were rimmed with frost. The window beside it wasn't open. There were no cracks in the walls. Yet every breath she took came out as visible mist. The firewood didn't burn. Even when lit, the flames danced low and weak, casting no heat. And worse, the brass box the strangers had left behind, once silent, had started clicking again. Fast, loud. It only clicked when Elijah entered the room. Edgar, now barely able to leave his bed, had grown so thin he looked almost transparent. His drawings were gone. He rarely spoke. But one afternoon, Eleanor heard him whisper. "He's not just listening anymore. He's starting to pull things in." "Things?" she asked gently, kneeling beside him. "What things?" Edgar stared at her with empty eyes and said, "From wherever he came from. From where the voices live." She held him tight and rocked him to sleep. That same night, Tobias vanished. No one heard him leave. His boots were still at the door. His coat still hanging on the wall. But the man was simply gone. In his place on the dining table was a crude wooden carving of the same spiral symbol Elijah always drew. But this one was different. It was three-dimensional, and if you stared at it long enough, it almost seemed to spin even though it didn't move. Eleanor burned it in the fireplace. It hissed but didn't catch flame. Only the metal poker, pressed hard against it for over an hour, managed to crack it into pieces. And that night, for the first time ever, Elijah smiled in his sleep. A week later, the pit in the orchard started to glow on its own. Edgar woke screaming, saying he could hear it humming from underground, even when he covered his ears. Eleanor tried to calm him, but he kept repeating the same thing. "It's not a hole anymore. It's a mouth." She checked the orchard herself the next morning. What she saw didn't look like dirt anymore. The stones around the edge had shifted, forming a perfect circle. In the center, the ground pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Above it, the air shimmered as if something invisible was rising from the soil. She backed away in horror. When she turned, she found Elijah behind her, barefoot in the snow. No footprints. No coat. Just standing there, staring at her with wide eyes. He tilted his head and said softly, "It's almost time." Later that evening, Eleanor gathered what little courage she had left. She packed a bag, wrapped Edgar in blankets, and told Elijah they were going to town. "No," Elijah replied. "You're not going anywhere. You can't anymore." "What do you mean?" she asked, heart pounding. "I asked it to stay asleep," he whispered. "But it's not listening now." Before she could react, the lights in the house flickered. The glass shattered in every room, windows, lamps, even the framed photos of the boys as babies. The fireplace went out, leaving only cold blue embers. Then the floor began to vibrate. Not shake, vibrate, like a deep humming engine beneath the foundation. Dishes rattled. Chairs moved an inch on their own. And from the orchard, a pale blue glow rose into the night sky like a silent flare. Elijah turned toward it. "It's here," he said, smiling. Eleanor grabbed Edgar and ran. She didn't make it far. From a distance, the neighbors saw the fire. The whole house engulfed in pale blue flames. Not red. Not orange. Cold fire. Fire that didn't burn. Fire that made snow fall upward. When they rushed to help, the door swung open on its own. Inside, the rooms were untouched by soot, but frost-covered from floor to ceiling. Paintings were frozen to the wall. Ice hung from the rafters. In the middle of the parlor stood Elijah, perfectly unharmed. Silent. Calm. Covered in ash, though nothing had burned. When they asked where his mother was, he looked confused and said, "She inverted." And Edgar? He was gone. No body. No footprints in the snow. No trail. Just one thing left behind. Underneath Edgar's bed, hidden inside the wall, they found a second pit. It was smaller than the first. And instead of glowing, it was pitch black, a perfect circle of absolute darkness that reflected no light. At the bottom of the pit, carved into stone, was the same spiral symbol. This time it wasn't carved into the rock. It was carved through it. As if whatever made it hadn't just scratched the stone, it had erased it from existence. After the fire, Elijah was taken in by the town orphanage. He didn't speak again for almost a year. When asked what happened to his family, he only said, "They followed the dream too far." He never cried. Never laughed. Never grew older. The nurses said he seemed frozen in time, his body the same size, his skin always cold. They gave him blankets. They checked for illness. But his temperature stayed low, and his heartbeat never rose above 40 beats per minute. In secret, one nurse wrote a letter to a university in Richmond. They never replied. But two men in black coats visited the orphanage the next week. They asked to see Elijah. When the staff refused, the men vanished. So did Elijah. He was gone the next morning. The only thing left behind was a single drawing, folded and tucked beneath his pillow. It showed a child standing at the bottom of a long staircase, looking up at a sky filled with eyes. At the bottom of the paper, written in neat, perfect script, were the words, "Not all doors open outward." In a locked archive room deep beneath the Virginia State Medical College, a box sat untouched for decades. It wasn't labeled. It didn't exist in the inventory. It was kept behind a false wall, its edges wrapped in aged cloth, sealed with a red wax mark, the spiral. The man who discovered it wasn't even supposed to be there. Dr. Clarence Mullen, a junior archivist, had simply followed a breeze, an unnatural draft coming from what should have been a solid wall of stone. Behind that wall, buried in dust and rot, sat Eleanor Henderson's journal. He didn't know what it was at first. The leather binding had fused shut. It took him 3 weeks to safely peel the pages apart. What he found would never be published. Not in any journal. Not in any study. Because once he read it, he never spoke again. That journal told the story of Elijah and Edgar. Of the fire. Of the pit. Of the visitors in black. And of something else. Something that never made it into town records or newspapers. The journal ended with one final line, scrawled hastily on a torn page. "If you're reading this, it means they failed to bury it. Burn it. Close the pit. But remember, it wasn't a boy. It was a voice. And it just needed a throat." Back in Shenandoah, the farmhouse was never rebuilt. Locals said the ground was cursed. Every tree that grew on the land twisted in strange ways, like something was pulling their roots deeper than the earth allowed. No birds nested there. No animals crossed it. And when children wandered too close, they complained of whispers. Not words, just sounds that made no sense, but felt like instructions. In 1874, a team of surveyors attempted to buy the land. They brought equipment, tents, and hired guards. By morning, all 5 were missing. Their camp was untouched. Their food was warm. But the spiral was carved into each tent post, identical, precise, as if done with a machine. The land was abandoned again. And the story of the Henderson twins faded from memory. Until one night in 1891, Dr. Mullen vanished. His office was locked from the inside. His coat still hung on the rack. On his desk was Eleanor's journal, burned from the inside out, yet the outer cover was perfectly intact. There was no sign of forced entry. No broken windows. No blood. Just a smell, like wet stone and iron. And on the wall behind his desk, drawn in chalk, was the spiral. But this time it had 3 arms, not 2. The college never released a statement. They sealed the room and reassigned the staff. And what happened next sealed the fate of the story forever. A month later, a memo circulated among a private circle of scientists, linguists, and military researchers. It contained a warning. Avoid further study of the Henderson case. Anomalous cognitive effects noted. Breakdown of memory function. Increased auditory hallucinations. Structural distortion of localized space. Investigation closed. Beneath that memo in handwritten ink. Not science. Not medicine. Not paranormal. Something older. Something deeper. Refuse the question. And so, they did. The aftermath no one talks about. No obituary was ever printed for Eleanor Henderson. No grave for Edgar. And Elijah? Rumors placed him in asylums, then in churches, then nowhere at all. Some say he never existed. Some say he still walks among us, not aging, not changing, simply waiting. Every few decades new reports surface. A boy in Missouri who never blinked and claimed to speak to the sky. A teenager in Canada who drew the spiral into his own skin. A child in rural Turkey who went missing near a deep hole in the woods, leaving behind only a note, "It's calling me home." None of these cases were connected officially. But the pattern is always the same. The voice, the spiral, the pit. Final entry. There is one final letter, sent anonymously to a radio host in 1953, never aired but kept in a locked cabinet until her death in 1984. In it the writer says, "You want to understand the twins? You can't. That's the point. They weren't a mystery for science. They were a mirror for us. Something that shows us what we refuse to admit, that the universe doesn't care if we're ready. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask. It just opens." Elijah wasn't chosen. He was noticed. And once it notices you, it doesn't stop. The letter was signed. H. But in faded ink underneath, a second signature. H again. Same initials. Same hand. Two names. One voice. Studio microphone. You've just heard the full case of the Henderson twins. The story that science refused to touch, buried under years of silence, sealed by fear, and almost erased by those who understood what it really was. Brain, what if it wasn't just a case? What if it was a warning? Scroll if this story disturbed you, it should. And if you think it's over, look again. The spiral still turns. Magnifying glass tilted left. This is Behind the Genius, where we pull the curtain back on the mysteries nobody wants to explain. White heavy checkmark. Subscribe if you want to uncover more forbidden stories. Cyclone, and remember, some knowledge doesn't enlighten. It awakens.